I wanted to go back to the question of drugs being marketed after only a phase 2 or early phase 2 trial. We understand the level of scientific demand for clinical trials. They should be conducted as best as possible. But at the same time, you have some patients with a fatal disease and who would love to benefit from any treatment, even if it carries a risk. So is it entirely satisfying that the authorities, public authorities, would tell someone whose life is threatened to say, okay, we'll decide for you if you have the right to take a product or not? So how can we answer that? You're right. You know, I talked deregulation from the standpoint of the agencies, drug agencies, but they deregulate on that on behalf of patients requiring innovative diseases. Well, first, you can have some illusion about the innovative character of drugs, and it's only from a given moment that you know whether the drug is efficacious or not. The way to solve that is to carry out an evaluation that does not prevent early access, we call it for compassionate use in France for patients who have no hope. So prior to the market authorization, if you have a fatal disease without a satisfying treatment, of course, it's worth trying something else. It's worth having that possibility. But one of the prerequisites for that, or the right conditions, for those patients, even if they're outside a clinical trial proper, you have to correctly evaluate what's happening with those patients as well. In France, it took us a long time to look at those compassionate use cohorts, because for a long time we gave access to the patients to those novel drugs without rigorously studying what was happening. That was a wasted loss of knowledge, if you will. It was harmful, and we overcame that now. So, yeah, at some point you can consider giving a drug that has not been completely evaluated if the patient is at risk of dying and it's worth trying. But if you give access too early to a drug that was poorly evaluated, the risk is that that drug will never be properly evaluated, because everything that was put in place by the public authorities in terms of conditional authorization, like, okay, this drug has not been completely evaluated, but you can put it on the market provided that you give us some trials afterwards to complete the information we have so far. But in practice, the pharmaceutical firms drag their feet. They proceed as slowly as they can, maybe not on purpose, because indeed then it becomes more difficult to enroll patients in those trials. It's true. But the post-market authorization trials for compassionate use, for example, it takes much longer than planned, and the authorities are not demanding enough. They just they don't get an answer. It's been described, and some people have that specialty. They published that in the BMJ. We looked 5 years later if we had gotten answers for drugs put on the market very early, 5 years after this early authorization. We still don't know. We still didn't get the supplementary information we needed, you see? So it's a balancing act between the interests of the patients and the participants. That's part of the complexity. You enroll patients in clinical trials to protect future patients. In order to avoid major disasters, you test on a few patients, and the knowledge you derive will allow you to avoid any big crash or big health crisis before selling it on a big scale. That's the value of it. But when you're in the other phase, I mean, you decide to give early access to drugs that were not properly evaluated, but because patients or their life is jeopardized, they're going to die in 6 months, it's their last chance. But unfortunately, you'll continue administering that drug to patients without knowing really whether the risk-benefit analysis is in favor of the patient or not. Many drugs are marketed today against cancer, for example, and many of those anti-cancer drugs really make the last moments of life of the cancer patients totally miserable instead of helping them. And hope, hope is crucial in medicine, but sometimes it has very harmful consequences as well. Ronnie Broman. Before handing over to Emmanuel Baron, I'd like to add to that. Isn't that the role of pharmacovigilance bodies? I mean, one of the benefits we could expect from serious pharmacovigilance is to inform us, to keep us informed about what happens after the early marketing of a drug, after only phase 2 trials. And another question, is it true that in the European framework, pharmacovigilance was placed solely in the hands of the pharmaceutical industry? That's what I heard a while ago. Is it still valid? Is it still true? Pierre Chirac. Well, yeah, you get lots of information on adverse effects after the marketing authorization from pharmacovigilance bodies, but real trials done after the marketing authorization can also give you more information. Big data as well, we don't know, but potentially, I mean, if it's robust big data, with a good analysis, it can shed more light and provide you with information. But the problem with pharmacovigilance is that the whole system is tied to reporting side effects. And caregivers, doctors primarily, would report undesirable side effects typically. Oh, and we know that, unfortunately, depends on the country as well. Actually, it's everywhere. Doctors are reluctant to report on side effects. It's not every day that a cancerologist seeing side effects in her patients would report those side effects. She might not even see those effects or not interpret them as undesirable, adverse, or side effects. The ones that are most reported on are those we're beginning to recognize as definitely being there. But before reaching the stage where you establish a link between the drug and a given side effect, it may take a long time because it's not taken into account. Look at the mediator case. Typically, I mean, it's very typical. No cardiologist was able to attribute heart valve problems to the taking of that drug. Neither did diabetologists or GPs. When they attributed it to something, it was to like acute rheumatoid arthritis. Even though we don't see many cases here in France, and all of a sudden there were 1,000 such cases. And then we heeded and we started collecting real reports on side effects, but it took a long time. Chiche in Marseille had a case of valvulopathy, but Servier, the pharmaceutical firm owner, and someone from the municipal council went to exert some pressure on that doctor to deter him from reporting the effects that were undesirable. So there was one case of valvulopathy in France, another one in Toulouse, but before the shit hit the fan, we had 2 cases only. And then we identified thousands of cases of very severe, very serious side effects. So it's very useful, pharmacovigilance, it should be done, but don't see it as a safety net. Now, In France, you have regional pharmacovigilance centers or bodies that do their job correctly. And in France, we kept an old system. The European Commission tried to decide that the firms themselves could report on side effects. But in France, we decided that the pharmacovigilance bodies, regionally or nationally, should also be in charge of reporting side effects, not leave it all to pharmaceutical firms. It's dangerous. We don't want to do that. All right, and to finish on that, before handing the floor for more questions, with the mediator case, you know, the whistleblower, Irène Frachon, this woman immunologist, she talked with experts on market authorization commission, and the experts on those commissions would ridicule her. And it turned out they were hired by Servier, and they criticized her. They tried to undermine her reports. And Servier, you know, it's one of their strong points, cardiovascular drug. And they would finance all the so-called congresses, medical conventions where cardiologists and pneumologists would get together. So they were absolute kings in cardiology and pneumology. And that's why maybe it was difficult to point out at pulmonary problems. And, you know, they have a tight control over what happens with the heart and the lungs. So, of course, other firms tried to say that Mr. Servier was sort of a sociopath, Mr. No, maybe so. But anyway, you know, those are structural flaws that we can identify in the whole pharmaceutical industry.